Hey, welcome back. This series is going to break something open that almost nobody talks about honestly, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. For years you have been told a story about one tiny country in the Middle East, a story where the people arrived from nowhere, stole somebody else's homeland, and have been oppressing the natives ever since. It sounds clean, it sounds simple, it sounds like justice, and almost every word of it is wrong. Here's a little parable to set the mood. Once upon a time, a neighbor moved into a house that had been in his family for 3,000 years. He planted a garden, built a small workshop, and invited his cousins to come help. A few streets away, another family had arrived more recently, kept expanding their fence, and started insisting the whole block had always been theirs. When a fight finally broke out, the newspapers wrote a headline that only mentioned who threw the last punch. They did not mention who started the construction, who lived there when the street was first paved, or who was actually breaking the rules right now. That headline is the story you have been fed. If that kind of deep dive matters to you, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because over the next few weeks we are going to dismantle the biggest pieces of that headline, one by one. Let's start with the foundation, the claim that Jews have no real ancient connection to this land and only showed up because Europe felt guilty after the Holocaust. Textbook archaeology tells a very different story. The Merneptah stele, carved by an Egyptian pharaoh around 1200 BCE, is the oldest non-biblical text on earth that uses the word Israel to describe a people living in the hills of Canaan. The Tel Dan stele from the 9th century BCE mentions the House of David by name. The Ketef Hinnom scrolls, the City of David excavations, ancient tax records from the Ottoman Empire, pilgrim diaries from the 1500s, and the British census of Palestine all point in the same direction. There was a continuous Jewish presence here for 3,000 years, through empires, through exile, through everything. Look at the numbers from the 1800s. Jews were already the majority in Jerusalem. They owned most of the land in the early farming colonies of Petah Tikva and the surrounding villages, and across the Ottoman and British records, Jewish communities in Hebron, Safed, Tiberias, and Gaza show up again and again. This was not empty land waiting for a flag. It was a lived-in homeland with ancient roots, and the people who built it never actually left. The Holocaust Guilt story is the second piece of the lie. It is not that the Holocaust did not matter, it mattered enormously, but the legal and historical paperwork for a Jewish state was already drafted before World War II even began. The Balfour Declaration in 1917, the San Remo Conference in 1920, and the League of Nations Mandate in 1922 all formally recognized the Jewish right to a national home in this land. Resolution 18.1 in 1947 was not the starting gun, it was the last lap of a race that had already been run. Cutting off the Jewish story at 1945 is like starting the biography of America at 1960 and pretending the revolution never happened. Then comes the refugee piece. You have probably been taught that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were violently expelled in 48 and became refugees. What you were not told is that between 1920 and 1948, the Arab population of Mandatory Palestine nearly doubled, from about 650,000 to 1.2 million, because immigration from Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, and Sudan was flowing in the whole time. UNRWA also made history by giving refugee status to the descendants of refugees forever. No other refugee group on earth has that rule. Apply the same standard to Jewish refugees expelled from Arab countries after 48, and you reach a completely different picture of who was displaced, when, and why. So the foundation cracks fast. The land was not stolen in a vacuum. The state was not invented in a moment of Western guilt. The refugee story is far more complicated than a single black and white headline. And that is only part one. Next time, we pull apart the legal labels, Apartheid, Occupation, and Colonial Project, and see how many of them hold up when you actually read the documents instead of the slogans. See you there. Welcome back. Last time we smashed the oldest myth in the book, the idea that Jews simply appeared out of nowhere and stole somebody else's homeland. Today we are walking into the courtroom, because the loudest accusations against Israel are dressed up in legal language, and legal language is supposed to mean something. So let's read the actual paperwork and see what it actually says. First, the apartheid label. In South Africa, apartheid was a system written into law that stripped black citizens of voting rights, of property rights, of where they could live, of who they could marry. The legal test for apartheid under the 1977 Convention requires domestic legislation enforcing racial domination. Open the basic laws of Israel and you find equal rights guaranteed, regardless of religion, race, or sex. Now look at who actually lives inside this system. Ayman Odeh led a major Arab political party into the Knesset. Haneen Zoabi sat in that same parliament and criticised the government on live television. Ruler Abu Dahab, a Muslim Arab physician, serves on the International Olympic Committee. Salim Gibran sat on the Supreme Court as its first Arab justice, and the current bench still includes George Kara and Omar Yunus. Arab doctors run departments in Israeli hospitals. Arab pilots fly Israeli airline routes. Druze and Bedouin officers serve as generals in the IDF. That is not the profile of a population living under institutionalized racial tyranny. That is the profile of a population with full legal standing, and a population that has the freedom to constantly complain about the country on its own television stations. Second, the Colonial Project label. The story says Israel is a Western outpost planted on Arab soil. The paperwork says something completely different. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, the San Remo Conference of 1920, and the League of Nations Mandate of 1922 all formally recognise the deep historical connection of the Jewish people to this land and their right to rebuild their national home there. Resolution 18.1 of 1947 was a recommendation inside this legal continuum. It was not a colonial grant from London to a bunch of strangers. It was an international confirmation of a claim that had been on file for decades. Many of the refugees arriving in mandatory Palestine between the 1880s and 1948 came from Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Sudan, the broader Middle East itself, not from Western Europe. The people who built the country spoke Arabic and Hebrew and Yiddish, not just English and French. Calling this a colonial project requires ignoring the language, the archaeology, and the passport origins at the same time. Third, the Occupation of Gaza label. This one is the easiest to check. On August 15th, 2005, Israel dismantled every single one of the 21 settlements inside Gaza, evacuated more than 8,000 of its own citizens, pulled out of 17 military bases, handed the keys to the Palestinian Authority, and withdrew completely. From that moment on, no Israeli soldier, no Israeli settler, and no Israeli civilian authority governed a single square metre of the territory. Gaza went its own way. It then elected Hamas in 2006, and in 2007, Hamas violently overthrew the Palestinian Authority in a coup. Since that day, the territory has been run by a designated terrorist organisation, recognised as such by the European Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and eventually the International Criminal Court. A state that physically leaves a territory, removes its own people, and then refuses to reoccupy it is not occupying it. A territory run by an enemy government that fires rockets at its neighbour is not the same as a peaceful neighbourhood under a foreign boot. The label stuck because it was useful, not because the legal facts changed. So when somebody tells you Israel is an apartheid state, an illegal colonial implant, and a brutal occupier of Gaza, ask a simple question. Show me the statute. Show me the court ruling. Show me the law that says so. Not the slogan, not the hashtag, the actual document. 9 times out of 10, there is nothing behind the curtain. Just a feeling, repackaged in legal vocabulary and broadcast loud enough that the world stopped checking. Next time, we will move from the courtroom to the casualty counts and see what happens when you actually interrogate the numbers instead of repeating them. Welcome back. So far, we have walked through the ancient paperwork and the legal paperwork. Now we have to walk through the blood paperwork, because nothing moves a crowd faster than a body count, and nothing gets manipulated faster than a body count. Before October 7th, Gaza was one of the most crowded places on Earth. Roughly 2.2 million people packed into a narrow strip of coastline. That number alone should stop you in your tracks, because if a real genocide were happening, the population curve would be going down sharply. It is not. Outside experts who tracked satellite imagery, housing damage, and movement data estimate the population decline over the following 18 months at somewhere between 5 and 15%. Tragic, painful, devastating for families, but nowhere near the definition of an attempt to destroy a people. Compare that to other counter-terror operations in Mosul, in Raqqa, in Mariupol, and you see the same picture. Urban war is brutal, and Israel fights inside cities that the enemy itself turned into forts. Now, how does a terror group fight back when its own civilians are in the blast radius? It hides behind them. United Nations investigators, European Union reports, and United States State Department documentation all confirm the same pattern. Command centers under hospitals, rocket launchers next to schools, tunnels under residential blocks. The Israeli Supreme Court itself, in a 2005 ruling, recognized this tactic as a war crime and ruled that even when faced with it, a democracy has to try to minimize civilian harm. That is the only military on Earth with a doctrine like that written into its field manual. Then there is the aid story. Over 700,000 tons of food, water, medicine, and shelter equipment moved into Gaza in the months after October 7th. At the peak, more than 1,000 trucks a day crossed the border, 4 times the pre-war average. The United Nations humanitarian chief himself admitted that the bottleneck was not delivery, it was looting. Convoys were seized, drivers were threatened, aid was taxed and resold. Cement meant for rebuilding homes was redirected into tunnel construction. The system was not starved from the outside, it was skimmed from the inside. Finally, the numbers themselves. The figure you hear repeated, 44,000 dead, comes from a single source, the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza, which does not separate fighters from civilians, which does not publish a body count, only a report of reports, and which has a documented track record of inflating figures when it serves a political purpose. Independent forensic reviews of major incidents, including the Al-Ahli hospital explosion, took about 48 hours for major Western newsrooms to quietly walk back their initial framing once the evidence came in. None of those retractions ever travels as far as the original headline. So next time someone shows you a number and asks you to repeat it in anger, slow down. Ask where it came from. Ask how it was collected. Ask who controls the press office that issued it. The tragedy is real. The families are real. The grief is real. But the story built on top of that grief has been engineered, and engineered stories need engineered numbers. Next time, we step out of the casualty reports and into the algorithm itself, the cameras, the captions, the funding pipelines, and the strange economics of who actually pays for this conflict and who profits from repeating it. Welcome back. So far, we have dug through ancient stones, legal documents, and casualty lists. Now we step into the last and strangest layer, the one that runs through your phone screen, your news feed, and the dollars moving behind the scenes. This is where the narrative stops being a story and starts being a product. First, the cameras. The term Pallywood has been around for years, and it was not invented to mock grieving families. It was coined to describe a documented pattern of staged scenes, recycled footage, and rehearsed performances that get pushed out as breaking news. Old videos from Syria, from Iraq, from Yemen keep resurfacing with new captions about Gaza. Stock photos of injured children get attached to dates that do not match the metadata. So-called witnesses give interviews to foreign outlets that later get quietly deleted or contradicted by their own families. In 2018, a famous blue shirt sniper clip was shown to be a staged fabrication. In 2023, that burning baby image turned out to be years old, and Reuters had to reverse the attribution. The pattern is not a conspiracy theory, it is a workflow. Cameras roll, actors perform, captions are added, and the algorithm does the rest. Second, the language. Words are doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Refugee, under the UN agency that handles Palestinians, has been redefined to include descendants forever, which is why the registered number has ballooned to nearly 6 million from an original population of around 750,000. No other refugee group on Earth works that way. The word resistance has slowly replaced the word terror in many headlines and academic papers, a quiet shift that turns armed groups into underdog freedom fighters. And the word genocide, which under international law requires proof of an intent to destroy a people, gets thrown around in opinion pieces the way a weather update gets thrown around. Each of these word choices is small on its own. Together, they redraw the moral map of an entire conflict. Third, the money. The myth says Israel is a puppet on American strings. The numbers tell a different story. American military aid runs around $3.8 billion a year, and roughly 3/4 of that must be spent on American-made weapons under a Buy American clause. In other words, it is a subsidy to American factories with a defense cooperation label. Meanwhile, Israel spends around $24 billion of its own money on defense every year and exports around $13 billion in weapons, making it the 7th largest arms seller in the world. Iron Dome, Arrow, David's Sling, the Trophy Active Protection System, all of it was built with Israeli research and Israeli budgets. Egypt, Jordan, and Pakistan receive comparable or larger packages and never get the same scrutiny. Volume and narrative priority decide who gets questioned, not the actual dollar amount. Fourth, the religious state myth. Open the actual Knesset record. Religious parties hold a minority of seats, and the loudest political battles of the past few years have been secular Israelis massing in the streets against a government they saw as too religious. Tel Aviv has ranked at the top of global LGBTQ travel indexes for over a decade. Surrogacy for gay men became legal in 2023. Christian communities in Nazareth, Haifa, and the Galilee have actually grown in population over the past 2 decades, and the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity, and the Western Wall all operate under Israeli protection. This is not a theocracy. It is one of the most religiously mixed democracies on the planet, which is exactly why the smears work for audiences who have never set foot there. So here is the thread tying all 4 episodes together. Every piece of the anti-Israel narrative, the ancient theft, the guilt-born state, the legal labels, the casualty counts, the staged footage, the twisted language, the puppet myth, the theocracy fantasy, depends on the audience never checking the underlying document. The story survives because people repeat the headline instead of opening the file. And once you start opening the files, the entire story reshapes itself. If this series made you slow down before you forwarded the next outrage, that alone was worth the time. Thanks for staying with me all the way to the end. Hit subscribe if you want more deep dives like this. Drop a comment with what you want me to break open next, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, stay kind, and stay skeptical.